I live in a quiet Texas suburb, the kind of place where the streets look almost too perfect, like someone designed them with a ruler and a color palette. Rows of single-family houses stretch along cul-de-sacs that all look eerily similar. The grass is cut to the same length, the driveways are spotless, and the flower beds in front of each home seem to bloom in synchronized cycles, as if nature itself signed a contract with the homeowners association. At first glance, it looks idyllic, almost cinematic. Friends from outside the neighborhood often say things like, "Wow, it's so clean here," or "I'd love to live in a place where everything looks so organized." And in a way, they're right. On the surface, everything is orderly. But what they don't see is the invisible pressure, the constant low-level surveillance that makes people trim their hedges twice a week and repaint their shutters at the first sign of fading. That's the real force behind the order, the HOA. For anyone unfamiliar, an HOA, or homeowners association, is like a private government that oversees the neighborhood. When you buy a house here, you're not just buying the walls, roof, and backyard. You're also buying into a set of rules, fees, and a council of neighbors who act as guardians of community standards. They send out newsletters filled with cheerful slogans about preserving property values. But behind those slogans are pages of fine print that dictate everything from what kind of fence you can build to how tall your grass can be before you get a warning letter. My own relationship with the HOA has always been complicated. On the one hand, I understand the idea. Nobody wants to live next to a house with peeling paint, a rusted car parked on the lawn, or holiday decorations still hanging in June. The HOA, in theory, is supposed to keep the neighborhood looking nice. But on the other hand, it sometimes feels like they're less concerned with community harmony, and more obsessed with flexing their bureaucratic muscles. Every month, like clockwork, we get a newsletter in the mailbox. Most of it is routine. Reminders about trash pickup, notes about seasonal landscaping, occasional announcements about community events. But tucked inside those newsletters are always reminders of the rules. All exterior paint colors must be approved. No lawn ornaments taller than 3 feet. Mailboxes must remain uniform in size and color. Those little sentences are like warning shots across the bow. Break one, and you'll get the dreaded violation notice. I had seen neighbors receive those notices before. Usually, it was something minor. Grass that grew half an inch too tall, a trash can left in view after collection day, a basketball hoop installed without permission. At first, I thought it was silly. Who cares if someone forgets to wheel their trash bin back into the garage for a day? But the HOA seemed to care very much. And everyone in the neighborhood lived with that knowledge. It was like a silent, invisible fence keeping us all in line. For the most part, I kept my head down. I didn't want to draw attention. I paid my dues on time, kept my yard neat, and tried not to rock the boat. I even found myself mowing the lawn at times I didn't feel like it, just to avoid being that guy who got a letter. There's a strange psychology that comes with living under an HOA. You start preemptively policing yourself, even when nobody is watching. The irony, of course, is that the HOA is technically just made up of neighbors, ordinary people who live in the same houses as the rest of us. But once they sit on that board, something changes. The title of board member seems to inflate their sense of authority. Suddenly they're not just your neighbor down the street. They're the gatekeeper of the neighborhood's aesthetics, the self-appointed protector of property values. It creates this odd hierarchy where people you wave to casually on morning walks also hold the power to fine you for something as small as the color of your mulch. Still, I never imagined I'd become one of the stories. Every neighborhood with an HOA has its legends. The tale of the guy who was fined for a slightly crooked mailbox, or the family forced to remove their string lights because they weren't seasonally appropriate. They're the kind of stories neighbors whisper about with equal parts amusement and fear. And until recently, I thought I'd never be one of them. But then came the letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope with the HOA's logo stamped in the corner. I almost tossed it aside, assuming it was another reminder about pool hours or landscaping services. But when I opened it, I found something different. A directive, a command. It was an official notice instructing every homeowner to repaint their mailboxes. Apparently, the board had decided that the uniform black mailboxes, which had been standard for years, no longer fit their vision for the community. Instead, they wanted them all repainted beige, a soft, neutral tone that they claimed would better align with the natural palette of the neighborhood. The letter gave us 30 days to comply. At first, I laughed. A beige mailbox? It sounded absurd. Mailboxes are supposed to be functional, not fashion statements. Who cared if they were black or beige? But as I reread the letter, the humor faded. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a requirement, and failure to comply could result in fines. I sighed, folded the letter, and put it on the counter. For the rest of the evening, I found myself glancing at it, like it was a small bomb waiting to go off. My wife rolled her eyes when I showed her. "It's just a mailbox," she said. "Paint it beige and be done with it." And maybe she was right. Maybe it wasn't worth the fight. But something about it gnawed at me. Not the color itself. I didn't care if the mailbox was black, beige, or bright pink. What bothered me was the principle. Why did a group of people I barely knew get to decide the color of the metal box at the end of my driveway? Why did they have the power to dictate something so trivial, and why did I feel powerless to resist? In the end, though, compliance won out. I told myself it wasn't worth the stress. If the HOA wanted beige mailboxes, then fine, I'd give them a beige mailbox. I bought the approved paint, spent a Saturday afternoon carefully applying 2 coats, and even added a layer of sealant to make sure it looked perfect. When I stepped back to admire my work, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about the color anymore, it was about doing it right, so nobody could say otherwise. Little did I know, that beige mailbox would soon become the center of a ridiculous storm. The kind of absurd conflict that makes you question the sanity of the system you live under. 2 weeks after I painted the mailbox, I stopped thinking about it. The beige had settled into the rhythm of the street as if it had always belonged there. A few neighbors were in the middle of repainting theirs too. One guy had taped off the post like a surgeon. Another had laid down a tarp with military precision. And a third had clearly given up halfway through, leaving a streaky, blotchy finish that looked like camouflage. The HOA's command had worked. Beige was the new black. So when the envelope came, I didn't expect trouble. It was the same white envelope with the HOA logo. I slid it open absent-mindedly as I walked up the driveway, my keys jangling against my palm. I unfolded the paper and stopped dead halfway to the door. Notice of violation stared up at me in bold. My stomach lurched in that specific way it does when a cop pulls behind you with lights off for just a beat too long. I read on. Violation. Unauthorized alteration of exterior feature, mailbox. Fine. $50. Additional fines of $50 per day will accrue until the alteration is corrected and brought into compliance. Notes. Mailbox color must not be altered without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. I blinked. Then I read it again, slower. My eyes darted to the date. It had been issued 3 days earlier. Unauthorized alteration? I walked to the end of the driveway and looked at the mailbox. The same beige they demanded, the same tidy brushwork I'd done carefully over a Saturday afternoon. I reread the letter from weeks ago in my head. Repaint your black mailbox beige within 30 days. I had complied. Exactly. Perfectly. How could that possibly be unauthorized? Inside, I put both letters side by side on the kitchen island like pieces of evidence in a crime drama. The mandate to make it beige. The violation for making it beige. It would have been funny if the second page didn't threaten $50 per day. Are you kidding me? My wife said, leaning over my shoulder. They told you to paint it. You painted it. Apparently we've altered our mailbox, I said, deadpan. To what? To the color they required, I said. She stared at me, then laughed, but the kind of laugh that comes from disbelief, not amusement. Call them. Right now. I called the management company number at the bottom of the notice. After a few rings and a long recorded menu that made me press 2, then 3, then enter my lot number, I reached a woman named Denise who offered me the friendly but distant tone of someone who resolves disputes for a living. I received a violation notice, I began. But I repainted my mailbox exactly as instructed in the community-wide letter. Beige. The same beige you guys required. Okay, let me pull up your file, she said. I listened to the quiet tapping of keys. I'm seeing an ARC compliance issue related to your mailbox color. Per the guidelines, all changes to exterior features require prior written approval. But this wasn't a personal change, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. It was a community directive. The HOA sent out a letter requiring everyone to repaint black mailboxes to beige. I complied. A pause. Do you have documentation of that letter? She asked. Yes, I said, glancing at the paper on the island. Dated last month. It literally says to repaint to beige within 30 days. Even so, she said, individual homeowners are required to file an ARC request form for any exterior modification. Without that form, the change is considered unauthorized. I pinched the bridge of my nose. So you're saying I needed to request permission to do something the HOA told me I was required to do? Correct, she said, as if explaining gravity. Otherwise it's an unauthorized alteration. And the $50 per day fine? I asked. It says it will accrue until I correct the alteration. What does that even mean? Paint it back to black and then reapply for permission to paint it beige again. I can't advise on hypothetical next steps, she said carefully. But if you'd like to contest the violation, you may attend the board meeting next week or submit a written appeal. I took a breath. Okay, I'll attend the meeting. Bring any documentation you want the board to review, she said. They'll hear you during the homeowner comments portion. After I hung up, I just stood there with the phone in my hand, staring at the notice. My wife slid a glass of water toward me. They can't be serious, she said. Oh, they're serious, I said. But they might also be wrong. That afternoon, I walked the street to cool my head and to get a better sense of whether I was alone. I stopped to chat with Carl 2 doors down. The kind of neighbor who always wears a baseball cap and whose lawn edges are crisp enough to slice a toe. Hey, Carl, I said, as casually as I could. You repaint your mailbox yet? Last weekend, he said, pointing with a thumb. 2 codes. You? Yep, I said. Got a violation for unauthorized alteration. Carl squinted. For the beige? The letter said. I know what the letter said, I replied. Apparently I was supposed to ask permission to do what the letter required. Carl let out a low whistle. That's rich. We were joined by Maria from across the cul-de-sac, who was carrying a bag of mulch and looked like she didn't have time for nonsense. Are you talking about the mailbox thing? She asked. Because I just got a reminder that I have 5 days left to paint mine. I've been busy. What's the problem? Unauthorized alteration, I said, holding up the notice. She scanned it, then looked at me like I'd just told her the sky is beige too. So the HOA told you to do it, and they're fining you for doing it. Exactly. Maria laughed without humor. My cousin got fined last year for a lawn flag because the pole was 6 inches too tall. I swear, sometimes they invent rules to justify their existence. I went home with a little solidarity and a lot of resolve. I sat at my laptop and scanned both documents, the community directive and the violation. Then I took photos of the mailbox, close-ups and wide shots, in case someone wanted to argue about the shade or condition. I found the exact sentence in the directive that said, all black mailboxes must be repainted to beige within 30 days, highlighted it, and printed it in 18-point font. If they wanted documentation, I'd give them documentation. As the $50 and the threat of $50 per day sank in, I started to do the math. If they refused to back down, this could spiral into something ridiculous. Hypothetically, 10 days late to their liking? That's $500 on top of the initial $50. 20 days? $1,000 for painting my mailbox the color they chose. The absurdity hardened into a kind of stubborn clarity. This wasn't just about me or about a paint color. It was about a system so enamored with its own forms and steps that it couldn't recognize compliance when it was staring it in the face. That evening, I drafted a short, calm email to the board and the manager. Dear board, I'm writing regarding violation _____ issued for unauthorized alteration of my mailbox. On date, I received a community-wide directive requiring all homeowners to repaint black mailboxes to beige within 30 days. I complied and repainted my mailbox to the exact color specified. I did not submit an ARC request because I understood the directive to constitute pre-approval. Attached are 1. The directive letter, 2. Photographs of my mailbox, and 3. A copy of the violation. I intend to appear at the board meeting on date to request that this violation and the associated fines be rescinded. Thank you for your time, name, address, lot hash. I pressed send and felt a small measure of relief. Action taken. Evidence compiled. The next step was the meeting. In the days that followed, the existence of the violation hung around the house like a mosquito you can hear but can't see. I'd be washing dishes and suddenly remember, $50 per day. I'd take the trash out and double take at the mailbox like it might have changed colors overnight to betray me. A couple of times I thought about slapping a post-it on it. This is beige, as requested. I didn't, but the urge said a lot about my mood. One morning, I spotted a white SUV idling at the end of the street, the kind I'd seen before when the management company does its drive-through inspections. I watched, coffee in hand, as it crept along slowly, pausing to jot something on a clipboard. A little jolt shot through me when it reached my driveway. The driver looked at the mailbox, looked at the clipboard, and moved on. It felt like being graded in public. By the eve of the board meeting, I had a stack of papers clipped together with the kind of earnestness you usually see in high school debate clubs. The directive, my photos, the violation, and a one-page summary with bullet points that read like a closing argument. Community directive required repainting to beige. I complied within timeframe. ARC request requirement is nonsensical in this context. Directive implies pre-approval. Threatened $50 per day fine to correct a condition that is the required condition. I rehearsed in my head what I'd say if they tried to pin this on me. I would be polite, patient, and precise. No sarcasm, no shouting. The goal wasn't to win an argument, it was to make it impossible for them to defend nonsense. The night before the meeting, I took one last walk to the mailbox. The evening was still and hot, the kind of Texas heat that lingers even after sunset. I put my hand on the metal and felt the residual warmth. Beige, a neutral, unassuming color that somehow had become a line in the sand. I smiled despite myself. All right, I said quietly to the silent street, as if the HOA were listening from behind the hedges. Let's see what you've got. Tomorrow, I'd walk into that meeting with my papers, my photos, and a story so straightforward it would either fix itself or expose something rotten. Either way, I was ready. The evening of the HOA board meeting arrived with the same quiet tension as waiting for a doctor's appointment. I had my documents stacked neatly inside a manila folder, clipped and highlighted, my photos tucked into plastic sleeves like evidence in a courtroom. It felt absurd to be preparing this way for something as trivial as a mailbox color, but absurdity had become the theme of the whole affair. As I drove toward the clubhouse where meetings were held, the sky glowed with the last orange streaks of daylight. It was the kind of Texas summer evening when the air stays thick even after the sun dips below the horizon. The parking lot was half full: pickup trucks, SUVs, a minivan with a faded soccer decal. I pulled into a space, cut the engine, and sat for a moment with the AC still blowing, taking a breath before stepping into the lion's den. Inside, the clubhouse smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a long table where the board members sat, their name placards lined up like little shields. Behind them hung a banner with the HOA's name and logo, as if to remind us that this was not merely a group of neighbors but an institution. The atmosphere buzzed with a low murmur. About 30 homeowners had shown up, some clutching papers, others simply curious. I spotted Carl near the back and gave him a nod. He lifted his baseball cap slightly in return. Maria sat in the second row with her arms crossed, already looking annoyed, as though bracing herself for whatever nonsense might come. I signed my name on the attendance sheet at the door. The volunteer handing out agendas gave me a polite smile, one that seemed rehearsed from years of dealing with homeowners. The agenda listed routine items, budget review, landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, and, near the bottom, the line that mattered: homeowner comments. That was my slot. I chose a seat 3 rows back, close enough to be heard but far enough to watch the board. 7 people sat at the table: 4 men, 3 women, all in varying degrees of business casual. Some looked bored already, flipping through papers. The property manager, a woman in her 40s with a stack of folders and the air of someone juggling too many tasks, sat at the far end, whispering occasionally to the president. When the meeting was called to order, the president tapped a gavel on the table. It wasn't necessary, the room wasn't noisy, but it sent a message. Authority had entered. The first 40 minutes were uneventful. Budgets, contracts, landscaping bids. A debate about whether to replace a row of shrubs near the entrance. One board member asked if it was worth the expense. Another insisted curb appeal was everything. I watched, half listening, my mind rehearsing the lines I'd practiced. The wall required repainting. I complied. The violation contradicts the directive. Here is the proof. Finally, after an eternity, the president announced, "We'll move on to homeowner comments. If you'd like to address the board, please come to the podium, state your name and lot number, and keep your remarks to 3 minutes." 3 minutes. That was the window between me and continued absurdity. My heart thudded as I stood. The shuffle of my shoes against the tile seemed louder than it should have been. I carried my folder like a briefcase, walked to the podium, and adjusted the microphone. "Good evening," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "My name is name. I live at address, lot, hash. I'm here regarding a violation notice I received for my mailbox." A few heads in the audience perked up. People knew about the mailbox directive. Some had probably painted theirs, some hadn't. They were curious. I opened the folder and held up the first page. Last month, the HOA sent out this community-wide letter. I read directly from it. All black mailboxes must be repainted to beige within 30 days. I let the words hang in the air for a moment, then set the paper down. I complied. I repainted my black mailbox beige, exactly as required. And yet, a week later, I received this. I held up the second letter. A violation for unauthorized alteration of my mailbox, with a $50 fine, and a threat of $50 per day until I corrected it. A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. I continued, calm but firm. To be clear, the violation claims I altered my mailbox without approval. But the alteration was the exact action required by the HOA's own directive. There is nothing to correct. My mailbox is beige, as instructed. The violation contradicts the directive. The president leaned back in his chair, brows furrowing. Other board members glanced at each other. I saw one of them whisper to the manager, who looked suddenly busy with her papers. I pressed on. I brought both documents for the board to review, along with photographs of my mailbox. I asked that this violation and the associated fine be rescinded, since compliance with a mandatory directive should not require additional approval. I stepped back slightly, hands resting on the podium, waiting. The silence stretched. Then one of the board members, a woman in a blue blouse, leaned toward her microphone. "Wait, we sent a letter requiring repainting?" The property manager hesitated. "Yes," she said finally. "A community-wide compliance directive was issued." The woman blinked, then looked at her fellow board members. A few shook their heads as if they hadn't known. "That explains why I've seen beige mailboxes popping up," another board member muttered. The president cleared his throat. "So you're saying the violation notice was issued because you didn't file an ARC request?" "Correct," I said, "but the directive itself was effectively pre-approval. Otherwise, every single homeowner would need to submit identical request forms to repaint the same color the board already mandated." More murmurs, this time sharper. Someone in the audience chuckled audibly. Maria crossed her arms tighter, clearly enjoying the spectacle. The president turned to the property manager. "Did we require ARC requests for this?" The manager shifted in her seat. "It may have been a miscommunication," she admitted. "The compliance team interpreted the repainting as a modification requiring approval." The man 2 seats over slapped his hand lightly on the table. "That's ridiculous. We can't fine homeowners for following a directive we sent. If we required the color, that's pre-approval by definition." The room buzzed. Carl leaned back in his chair, grinning like a man watching a soap opera unfold. I stood silently, resisting the urge to add commentary. My job was done. I'd put the evidence in front of them and let their own contradictions unravel. The president finally raised a hand for quiet. "All right. Thank you, Name. We'll discuss this now." I returned to my seat, folder under my arm. Heart still beating a little fast but with a sense of relief creeping in. Whatever happened next, the absurdity was on the record. The board had to deal with it. I had barely settled back into my seat when the board began their deliberation. It was like watching a play unfold on stage. 7 people in folding chairs suddenly animated, voices rising and falling as they wrestled with the absurdity of their own system. The president adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Well, this is obviously unusual. On one hand, we have the directive that was sent. On the other, the violation that was issued. We need to determine if the violation was appropriate." "Appropriate?" the man 2 seats down scoffed. "It's nonsense. We told homeowners to paint their mailboxes beige. He painted his beige. Then we fined him for it. How does that make sense to anyone in this room?" A ripple of laughter passed through the audience. Even Carl chuckled quietly. I bit my tongue to avoid grinning too openly. The woman in the blue blouse leaned forward. "I honestly didn't even know about this letter. Who authorized it?" All eyes turned to the property manager. She shuffled her papers and said carefully, "It was drafted by the compliance team based on board discussions about uniformity. The directive was reviewed and sent under my office." "So the board didn't vote on it?" another member asked, eyebrows raised. There was a pause. "It was considered an administrative matter," the manager said. The president frowned. "Well, clearly it's become more than that." The man who had scoffed earlier leaned back in his chair. "This is exactly the kind of thing that makes homeowners hate us. We can't claim to care about compliance and then punish people for complying." The woman beside him nodded. It makes us look ridiculous. And frankly, it undermines trust. If I were in his shoes, I'd be furious too. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Maria smirked and whispered something to the person beside her, who stifled a laugh. The property manager spoke again, her voice defensive now. The compliance team interpreted repainting as an exterior modification, which under the covenants requires an ARC request. That's standard procedure. Standard procedure? The scoffing man snapped. It's bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy. Look at the outcome. We've threatened a homeowner with $50 per day fines because he followed instructions. That's not procedure, that's lunacy. The president raised a hand. Let's keep this civil. But even he looked uneasy, like he could feel the audience's mood shifting against them. I sat quietly, pulse still quick but steadier now. Watching them argue was oddly satisfying. For once, the spotlight wasn't on me, it was on the contradictions in their system. The woman in the blue blouse leaned toward her microphone again. I moved that we rescind this violation immediately and refund the fine. It was issued in error. The man beside her nodded. Second. The president looked around the table. All in favor? Hands shot up, 5 out of 7. One abstained, the property manager. Only one hand stayed firmly down. A man in a stiff polo shirt who looked like he'd been waiting all night to disagree with something. The motion passes, the president said. Applause broke out from the audience. It wasn't thunderous. This was still a suburban HOA meeting, not a rock concert, but it was genuine. Carl even whistled softly. I allowed myself a small smile, though I kept my hands folded in my lap. But the board wasn't done. The blue blouse woman spoke again. We should also address the underlying issue. If we're going to issue directives, they need to function as pre-approval. Otherwise, every homeowner will end up in this exact situation. And frankly, it's a waste of everyone's time. The scoffer nodded vigorously. Exactly. We can't demand uniform changes and then demand 30 identical forms to approve them. That's paperwork for the sake of paperwork. I move that any community-wide directive regarding uniform features, like mailbox color, be considered automatic pre-approval. No ARC request needed. Second, someone said immediately. The president looked mildly startled but went with it. All in favor? This time, 6 hands rose. Only the stiff man in the polo shirt resisted, his lips pressed into a thin line. The motion passes, the president declared. And just like that, the policy shifted. With a few words, they had created a rule that spared everyone else the same headache I'd endured. The crowd murmured approvingly. Maria clapped softly, as if applauding common sense itself. The property manager scribbled notes furiously, no doubt already dreading the task of rewriting procedures and notifying the compliance team. For a moment, the tension in the room broke. People laughed, a little incredulously. One man in the back muttered loudly enough to be heard, "Well, that's the first time I've ever seen the HOA admit they screwed up." Laughter followed. Even the president cracked a smile. I sat back, letting it all wash over me. Relief, vindication, even a touch of pride. What had started as a petty, absurd fine had ended in a policy change. My beige mailbox, of all things, had sparked reform. The president finally tapped the gavel again. All right, thank you, everyone. We'll move on to the next agenda item. But the mood in the room had shifted permanently. The board's authority, usually so heavy and unquestioned, had been punctured, if only for an evening, by laughter and common sense. As the meeting wrapped up and people filtered out, several neighbors stopped to pat my shoulder or whisper congratulations. Carl clapped me on the back. "Well done," he said. "You just saved us all a headache." Maria gave me a grin. About time someone stood up to them. Beige hero of the block. I laughed. Let's hope it sticks. Walking out into the warm night, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The fine was gone, the mailbox was safe, and the absurdity had been exposed for what it was. For once, I left an HOA meeting smiling. But I also knew this wouldn't be the last clash. In neighborhoods like ours, rules had a way of multiplying. There would always be another directive, another technicality, another absurd moment waiting just around the corner. Still, for tonight, victory belonged to beige. When I stepped out of the clubhouse that night, the air felt different. Maybe it was just the relief of knowing I wouldn't be bleeding $50 a day for following instructions, but I swear even the Texas heat seemed less oppressive. The parking lot hummed with conversation as neighbors lingered, still buzzing from what they just witnessed. Carl walked beside me toward our cars. "You know," he said, tugging at the brim of his cap, "I've sat through a dozen of these meetings, and that's the first time I've seen them backpedal like that. Usually it's all stone faces and rules are rules. Tonight, they looked human." I laughed softly. Maybe because they realized the rules contradicted themselves. Or maybe, he said, because the whole room was ready to laugh them off the stage. That helps. We shook hands before parting ways. As I climbed into my car, I noticed Maria waving at me across the lot. "Nice work," she called. Mailbox martyrdom paid off. I grinned and waved back. It felt strange to be congratulated for something so trivial, yet I understood. The absurdity had touched everyone. My case had become a mirror for their own frustrations. At home, my wife had already poured 2 glasses of wine. "So," she asked the moment I walked through the door. "They rescinded it. Refunded the fine too," I said, setting the folder on the table like a conquered banner. She raised her glass. "To beige justice." We laughed, clinked glasses, and for the first time in weeks, the looming presence of the mailbox was gone. No more dread each time I checked the mail. No more paranoia when the compliance SUV rolled by. Just a beige box at the end of the driveway, quietly doing its job. Still, as I lay in bed that night, I kept replaying the meeting. The confusion on the board's faces when I read the directive aloud. The awkward silence when they realized most of them hadn't even seen it. The quick scramble to cover the mistake. And then, the laughter, rare, genuine laughter in a room usually steeped in tension. It struck me how fragile the HOA's authority really was. On paper, they had power. The ability to fine, to demand, to dictate. But when confronted with their own contradiction in front of a room full of neighbors, their authority had cracked. A simple beige mailbox had revealed the truth. Much of their power depended on compliance through intimidation, not logic. The days that followed carried a strange afterglow. Neighbors stopped me on walks to bring it up. "I heard what you said at the meeting," one woman told me while watering her roses. "Good for you. I always feel too nervous to speak up." At the community pool, a man I barely knew gave me a nod and said, "Thanks for saving me the paperwork." I was dreading that ARC form. Even kids seemed to pick up on it. One afternoon, a teenager rode past on his bike and shouted, "Nice mailbox, mister," before pedaling off laughing. It was ridiculous, but I had become the accidental protagonist in a small suburban drama. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. A few days later, I saw the stiff man in the polo shirt, the only board member who had voted against rescinding the violation, walking his dog. He gave me a curt nod, no smile. His dog sniffed at my lawn like it was searching for evidence. For a moment, I felt a flash of paranoia. Would he hold a grudge? Would I become a target for nitpicky inspections? But then I remembered the laughter, the vote, the motion that passed. Whatever personal irritation he carried, the board had spoken. And besides, what could he do? Write me up for excessive compliance? At work, I found myself retelling the story over lunch. My coworkers leaned in, wide-eyed. "Wait, so they told you to paint it beige, you painted it beige, and they fined you for it?" one asked. "Exactly. And then you went to the meeting and they admitted they were wrong? Pretty much. The table erupted in laughter. Man, someone said, shaking their head, that's the most WA story I've ever heard. I realized then how universal these tales were. Across the country, people had their own versions: fines for weeds, demands about Christmas lights, absurd disputes over fences. My story was just another chapter in the grand anthology of WA madness. Still, I couldn't shake a deeper thought. How easily small systems of power can spiral into absurdity when no one questions them. It wasn't malice that created my violation, it was bureaucracy. A compliance team interpreting rules too literally, a manager signing off without oversight, a board unaware of what had been sent in their name. A chain of small failures that added up to one ridiculous outcome. And if I hadn't spoken up, if I'd just paid the fine quietly to avoid trouble, the system would have carried on unchallenged, emboldened to issue more nonsense next time. That realization unsettled me. It also made me grateful that I had gone, that I had stood at that podium with my folder and my calm voice. Not because I enjoyed it, public speaking is nerve-wracking, but because it mattered. Sometimes, standing up isn't about grand causes. Sometimes it's about beige mailboxes and the principle behind them. One evening, about a week later, I took a slow walk down the street. The mailboxes stood in neat rows, almost all of them beige now. Some were freshly painted, others still showed streaks of black beneath rushed brushstrokes. Together, they looked like an army of little beige soldiers, lined up in obedience. I paused at mine, running a hand along the smooth paint. It no longer felt like just a mailbox. It felt like a symbol. Proof that even small absurdities can be challenged, that logic can occasionally win over bureaucracy. I chuckled to myself. The beige rebellion, I thought. Maybe someday that's how the neighbors would remember it. Of course, life went on. The WA still existed. The newsletters still arrived. The rules were still there, waiting. But for once, I didn't feel entirely powerless. I had tested the system and survived. And maybe, just maybe, the next time the board considered some new directive, they'd remember the night the room laughed at them over a mailbox. Maybe they'd think twice. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things. But sometimes, small victories matter the most. Weeks passed, and the storm around my beige mailbox gradually faded into memory. The violation notice was rescinded, the fine refunded, and the directive clarified. The WA moved on to other matters: pool maintenance, landscaping contracts, debates about holiday lights. Life in the neighborhood slipped back into its usual rhythm of quiet streets, manicured lawns, and occasional grumbles about dues. But for me, something fundamental had shifted. Each time I walked past my mailbox, I felt a flicker of satisfaction, not just that I'd won, but that I'd pushed back against the absurdity of unchecked bureaucracy. A beige mailbox had become a small monument to reason, an ordinary object with an extraordinary story. I began to notice how many of my neighbors looked at their own mailboxes differently. Some of them nodded at me when they saw me walking, as though we shared a private joke. Others would smile faintly when they passed my house, the kind of smile that says, "You really did that." Even the kids riding by on bikes would point at the mailboxes, laughing like they were in on the story. One Saturday morning, I was trimming the hedges when Carl strolled up. He leaned against the fence and said, "You know, you changed something. It might not seem big, but you did." I raised an eyebrow. "Changed what?" "There's still the WA." "Yeah," he said, "but you showed them that people notice, that people will call them out. That matters." I shrugged, smiling. All I did was read their own letter back to them. "Sometimes that's all it takes," Carl replied. "People think power's about big moves. But most of the time, it's about who bothers to show up with receipts." I thought about that long after he left. Maybe he was right. Maybe power isn't always about who has the loudest voice or the most authority. Sometimes it's about who points out the obvious contradiction nobody else wants to admit. At work, my story had become a running joke. Colleagues would tease me about my beige revolution. One even brought me a coffee mug that said "Compliance Hero" in block letters. I laughed, but part of me embraced the title. There was something oddly empowering about it. My wife teased me too. "Careful," she said one evening, "if you keep this up, they'll vote you onto the board." The idea horrified me. Sitting through hours of debates about shrub height and parking violations? No thank you. But still, I understood the temptation. Maybe the best way to fix absurd rules was to be on the inside. Then again, maybe the system itself was designed to produce absurdity no matter who sat at the table. One night, I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the sunset fade over the row of beige mailboxes. They stood there quietly, little monuments to conformity. I wondered how many arguments, fines, and debates they had already generated. Probably more than anyone could count. It struck me how much energy we humans spend on rules that, in the end, mean almost nothing. The color of a mailbox. The angle of a lawn sign. The timing of Christmas lights. Tiny details elevated into battlegrounds of principle. Maybe it wasn't really about aesthetics or property values. Maybe it was about control, about giving people a framework where they could enforce order, however trivial. And maybe that was the most absurd part, that we all went along with it. We agreed to live under these micro-governments, to pay them money, to let them dictate the color of our mailboxes. Because deep down, we wanted order too. We wanted to believe that if the mailboxes matched, the world made sense. In the weeks after the meeting, I noticed subtle changes. The newsletters grew a little more careful in their wording, as if someone was double-checking before sending them out. The compliance SUV still cruised through, but it didn't linger as long at driveways. And the board meetings, according to Carl, felt slightly less rigid. It wasn't a revolution, but it was something. One evening, Maria stopped me as I walked past her yard. "Hey, beige hero," she said with a grin. "You know you've got a reputation now." "Oh?" I asked. "Yep, people talk. They say, if the board tries anything crazy again, maybe he'll handle it." I laughed, shaking my head. "I'm not volunteering for that job." "Doesn't matter," she said. "You already did it once. That's enough." The stiff man in the polo shirt remained stiff. He never acknowledged me beyond curt nods, his dog tugging impatiently on the leash. I could almost hear the unspoken words in his silence, "Troublemaker." But the rest of the board had moved on, and his vote against me had been outnumbered. Sometimes, I wondered if he was right in his own way. Maybe the HOA needed people like him, unyielding, rule-obsessed, unwilling to bend. Without him, maybe there'd be no resistance at all. Maybe absurdity requires a straight face to exist. But I couldn't help smiling each time I remembered his expression when the motion passed. The look of a man watching his neat little box of rules unravel in public. Months later, the beige directive became old news. Every mailbox was painted, every violation resolved. But the story still lived on. At block parties, someone would bring it up. At the pool, parents would whisper about it while watching their kids. And always, there was laughter. And maybe that was the best outcome of all. Not just the rescinded fine, not just the policy change, but the shared humor. In a neighborhood bound by rules and conformity, we had shared a moment of collective absurdity, and survived it with laughter. Looking back, I realized that the beige mailbox had given me a strange kind of gift: perspective. Life under an HOA can feel suffocating, like living under constant surveillance for crimes as small as a weed or a mailbox color. But sometimes, the cracks show. Sometimes, the system trips over itself. And when it does, it reminds you that power is only as strong as the people willing to obey it without question. I had questioned it. And, surprisingly, the world hadn't ended. So now, whenever I walk past that mailbox, I don't just see beige paint. I see a story. I see a reminder that logic can prevail, that laughter can disarm authority, and that even the smallest battles can matter. It's just a mailbox, but it's also more than that. Because in the end, the beige mailbox wasn't just about paint. It was about principle. And maybe that's the lesson of suburbia. Sometimes the fight for freedom isn't about revolutions or grand causes. Sometimes it's about the right to paint your mailbox the color they told you to, and not be fined for it.
Thanks for watching this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable HOA stories. Have you ever dealt with something this absurd in your own neighborhood? Share your experience in the comments below. I'd love to read your stories. And as always, stay tuned for the next episode.